that you are not being recorded. So, actually, would you mind switching the lights on, please, Sammy? Just flip all the switches up. Yep, all of them. And then that's it. Cool. Thank you. Once again, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thanksgiving. It's that time of year again, isn't it? It's starting to get cold. Leaves are lying all over the ground. I went away for a couple of weeks and I came back and it's brown. And so we've got Thanksgiving this week. Wow. And I'm talking about Thanksgiving particularly because it is a difficult time. And a lot of people are struggling. I've had conversations with people who, do I really want to celebrate Thanksgiving this year? I'm just not sure I've got anything to be thankful for. So if our practice isn't of any use to us in a time like this, it's really not much use at all. So I want to talk about Thanksgiving. I'm going to start, this is going to get a little bit dark probably before it gets a little bit bright again. And I promise it does get bright, at least it does for me, I hope it does for you. So I'm going to start with the holidays are just generally difficult, and it's easy to forget that. If I look back to my childhood, we had this wonderful Christmas. You know, we grew up where Christmas was the great consumer festival. It wasn't a religious festival, it's a consumer festival. So Christmas was all about big tree, lots of food, presents. So every Christmas was just such a great family event. We'd all come downstairs, eventually the door would be open and we'd go into our presents, and it would never be what I wanted. Never. I have a memory one year of it in the early teens, I wanted a Monty Python annual. And I fully expected I'd find this Monty Python annual and I'd spend the day reading the Monty Python annual. I got there, it was a goodies annual. None of you have ever heard of the goodies. But what happened is my dad went to the bookstore, he looked at Monty Python, he thought, this is a little too racy for my son, I'll get him something else. Holly, who is my ex-wife and the mother of my children, mother of our children, every year she thought was going to be the year she got a pony. It never happened. We all have our own sets of trauma that show up at the holidays, but the holidays are just generally a difficult time, and it's really easy to forget that. I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was 2021, was like the year everybody said, this is the worst year ever. I am so glad this year's over. I can't wait. I think that was 2021. How quickly we forget. And then a few years before that, I'm losing dates, but it would be 7 years ago, after Donald Trump was elected president. That was such a divisive event, and I'm not picking sides of Trump versus Biden or whoever at this point. It's simply, it was divisive, and there was so many people after that election who said, I can't go home because our family is going to be divided across this political spectrum. I don't know how to talk to my family. How quickly we forget. And then, of course, last year, of course I remember talking about this last year, but the of course is about the history of Thanksgiving. Last year I talked about Thanksgiving, about the Wampanoag. And I neglected shamefully to remember that we did our service this morning on the ancestral grounds of the Muskogee indigenous peoples. Particularly shameful because I'm bringing this up, right? How we've totally and royally screwed the indigenous peoples. The Wampanoag, the Caucasians, the Latinos and Caucasians were coming across from Europe for many years before the Pilgrims finally landed. And as they started coming in, they thought it was just wonderful that all this space was being opened up for them, because the Wampanoag they lived in like 20 or 30 settlements in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, that kind of part of the country. They seemed to be withdrawing. Well, the truth is, they were dying. Like 90% of that indigenous population died because of disease. So when the Pilgrims finally did land, that was such a diminished population. They were weak and they were under assault from another indigenous population. I can't remember the name of the tribe offhand. But they decided to cut a deal with the Pilgrims. You give us weapons so we can defend ourselves, and we'll give you some food. I mean, so this leads to our Thanksgiving. It's not so thankful for a large number of people. So that's just little, stuff that's easy to forget. Other stuff that's easy to forget is a little bit of the current climate. So we find ourselves sitting here right now thinking about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, and it is awful. But we forget that a month ago we were sitting here thinking about how awful what was going on in the Ukraine was. And we forget that not long before that, probably a year or two, we were thinking about how awful what was going on in Syria was. And then, of course, there's what's going on in Ethiopia and Eritrea, which over here, we just don't pay much attention to. But it's grotesque. And what's going on in Mali? What's going on in Myanmar? What's going on in the Central African Republic? There's civil wars breaking out all over Africa. Turkey. I've got dear friends whose family are imprisoned in Turkey. These are people who go around the world building schools, and they're just beautiful, beautiful humanitarian people. And they can't go home because they've run afoul of Erdogan, and their family are basically being held hostage to try and make them come home. And then, of course, you've got the Kurdish population in Turkey as well. So we could look all over the world, but this is just awful. So, I'm going to make a controversial statement here, which is arguably social media has destroyed democracy. Whether that's true or not, things are very difficult culturally, and we've got a lot of spiraling of these kind of conversations and things getting out of control very quickly. And once this kind of pain, this kind of suffering happens, it just takes time for it to heal. You can't heal it overnight. It just takes time. Many of you know that I spend a lot of time reading and watching Shakespeare. Shakespeare, well, a couple of hundred years before Shakespeare, the population of England diminished by like 10 or 20% across the whole country because of the plague. And it did not recover. It just didn't recover for a couple of hundred years. So that's just the country I know something about. I mean, the rest of the world, much of it even worse. And Shakespeare wrote a number of his plays. They're the history plays. They're rather more than history plays, but they are history plays among other things. And they chronicle things like Henry IV, who killed his predecessor in basically a civil war he created. And Henry V, who decided that to distract the British population, he'd go conquer France, which used to be a British territory and then wasn't. And so what happened? Well, all the ordinary folks got enlisted, or they would have been killed, and they went with their pitchforks and their hoes across to France to kill French people. I mean, so as I say, kind of dark, but it's this is the way the world is. The history of the human race is a history of clinging. The Buddhist idea, dependent and 12 links of dependent origination. The history of the human race is a history of clinging. And if you want to go more than that, evolution has been a thing on this planet for 3.8 billion years. Yes, it explains behavior. Yes, we can say we get angry because this, and it's this defensive mechanism, this survival mechanism for the species. It's 3.8 billion years of history of clinging. That's all it is. It's not different than the Buddhist teachings. It's absolutely the center of what we're practicing with. 3.8 billion years of clinging. Not a surprise that when we sit here in our little lives and we try and unpack what's going on and we try and find release from this, that it's hard. Because it is hard. This is what we're dealing with. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Well, the Buddha, we can't save the world. We cannot save the world. One of my favourite little stories, which many of you heard me talk about, is I got this from Sayadaw U Pandita, who was a Burmese teacher and a teacher for like Goldstein and Cornfield and that crowd, and many, many others. And he takes the Brahma Viharas and he says, kindness or metta is like a mother with an infant. She just wants it to grow up healthy. Compassion is what a mother feels for the 2 or 3-year-old child who's sick. She just wants it to get well. Loving kindness is for the teenager who's starting to date, who's on the varsity team. Things are going pretty well and she's goes ups and downs, but she's joyous. The mother's joyous with the child. And equanimity is for the 20 or 30-year-old who's married, got kids, life's going pretty well. They're resilient, they look after themselves, they don't need the mother involved anymore, but the mother still loves them and is equanimous. So the Brahma Viharas can be talked about in that sense. And it becomes very personal. These are human level relationships. We can understand and deal with this at a human level. It's when it becomes bigger than that it becomes overwhelming. And we let ourselves get caught up in this bigger, overwhelming stuff. If we can bring it down to a human level, it becomes much more manageable. And the Buddha never said he could save the human race or the world. And demonstrably, he didn't. Because if he had done, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? He didn't do it, and he didn't say that's what this practice promised. Jesus the same. He didn't promise to save the world. He promised that you didn't have to suffer. And the church then tells you that if you accept he died for your sins, you will be saved and you will go to heaven. So it's release from this suffering at an individual level. So the promises of this individual release, it's not of saving the world. And if we go out and we try and save the world, we're going to cause ourselves problems. And when we go out and save the world, a lot of things happen. If only these people would do this. If we just got rid of the bad people in power. Well, you can't get rid of the bad people in power, particularly in democratic countries, because the majority of people wanted them in power. It's not quite that simple, but directionally it doesn't work, because a lot of the people think differently than you do. So these fixes we dream up, a definition of suffering is the gap between the way things are and the way we want them to be. So as we start to fix things in our head this way, we're creating that gap and we're causing ourselves suffering. So we can never solve the world looking outside. We can never solve the world looking at what other people should be doing, what other people have done that's wrong. And that's absolutely what the Buddha taught. You can't do this. It doesn't work. What we do is we come inside. And so when we come inside, and this brings us back to, so what do we do? And it takes us to what we do at Thanksgiving. When we come inside, Dalai Lama said, my religion is kindness. And the Buddha's teaching, in the Pali Canon, the Buddha started by teaching generosity. And if people get generosity, then he will graduate them, if you will, to the virtues, to the precepts. So if you're capable of understanding and living in a world of generosity, then you're capable of understanding and living in a world where you follow basic guidelines of virtue. And if that then becomes the foundation of your life, then that positions you to move into the contemplative life and start meditating. We kind of do it backwards in this country. We jump into meditation and it's not going to work because we don't have the foundation for it. If you don't have a basic, these are moral, ethical, virtuous, these are words that have valence in this country that can be awkward, but I'm going to use the word. So if you don't have that basic framework, meditation doesn't have a place to land. Yes, you can empty the mind, but it probably doesn't work because you don't have that frame of reference to relate to the world with. So, when we come to Thanksgiving, first thing, be generous. And this is a guideline for everything we do in life. Slow down. Am I being generous? Or am I being selfish? Being generous is about giving of yourself something that is important to you. It's not rummaging around in your loose change and just throwing some loose change, or clearing out a room that's too crowded, getting a box of stuff you don't want and taking that to charity. That's not generous. Generosity is something that matters to you. Practice generosity. It is transformational. Another one of my personal stories that many of you have heard. Christmas. This would be almost 20 years ago. Right around 20 years ago. My mum and dad came over for Christmas just once. They only came over once for Christmas, and I've lived in this country for well over 30 years at this point. My kids were 8 and 10, something like that at the time. So it was a really big deal, and I wanted to make this very special. So I thought very carefully about what shall I get Mum and Dad for Christmas, because gifts are something you do, right? So my dad had an amazing ear for music. Mum played the piano, and she played it very, very well. But he had an ear for music that was incomparably better than hers. She'd be listening to music, she'd be cleaning or something, and she'd have the radio on, classic music radio. She'd say, "Oh, what's this?" And he'd be sitting in his armchair reading, and he'd look up and go, "Brahms Fourth." It's just amazing. His favourite, the music he loved, and he very rarely listened to music because it was so demanding on him, he had to concentrate so much. But his very favourite music was Benny Goodman, who was a jazz clarinetist. And his favourite instrument, of course, was the clarinet. He'd never played an instrument in his life, so I got him a clarinet for Christmas. And he opened this, and he was gobsmacked. He was just dumbstruck. And for the rest of the morning, when the kids were opening the plethora of, the ridiculous quantities of presents we bought them, he would sit there with this on his lap and his hands on it. And every now and again he'd just lift the lid up and look at it, smile, close the lid, and it was just beautiful. And you can tell it's just so moving, right? We get so much more out of giving than we do anything else. Practice generosity first. So take that with you to Thanksgiving. What can I do that is truly generous? And how can I stay in that posture of generosity? Second, the precepts. We actually, many people in this room will be formally receiving the precepts in 3 weeks, I think it is. 2 weeks. Wow, 2 weeks. Wow. Yes, it is, isn't it? It's 2 weeks. Zooming right in on us. No, it is 3 weeks. It is 3 weeks. It is 3 weeks. Yeah. So anyway, it's zooming in on us very, very fast. And we renew the precepts here every month. And by receiving the precepts and reminding ourselves of the precepts in that renewal, we are accepting this as a direction for living our lives. And it's pretty simple. Don't kill. Don't take something that's not mine. Don't engage in inappropriate relationships with people. Be very careful with how I speak. And don't get drunk and do stupid stuff. I mean, it's really not that. I mean, the rules are pretty simple. But if we take this seriously and we hold ourselves to it, it does change our lives. Because it means when we're tempted to do something and we've got this framework, and doing that would violate the framework, we remind ourselves and stay grounded on the framework. And we don't go off and do this thing and then agonize over it later and think, I shouldn't have done that. What if we stay true to the framework? There is, I think I got this from Joan Halifax, but there's another one of these things that I really like, which is we normally present in the world with a hard front and a soft back, which is to say we're normally rather brittle and fragile and not willing to shift and be vulnerable and be flexible. Where we are flexible is our spine, which is not holding true to our moral compass. That's how we normally show up in the world. That's the default. Because we succumb to social pressure, particularly social pressure of loved ones. The way we should present in the world is exactly the opposite. And that's holding true to this moral compass. It's holding true to living a life of virtue. We have this framework of virtuous behavior that is the single most important thing about the way we live our lives. It is inviolable. And we stay true to that. That's the firm back. And with that, that allows us to be very flexible. And that flexibility shows up as love and compassion. Because if we are true to ourselves in that way, it creates absolute space to open up to the suffering that shows up in front of us. And to be there with that suffering, with kindness and with compassion. And that means we stay true to our compass, which says we don't have to get into an argument about politics or picking sides or anything. We love people. We love our family, whatever they believe. And so we can make space to be with them and to love them and to not get sucked into these conversations. Something I meant to say a minute ago, when a couple of weeks ago I talked about Gaza and Israel, and there was a little vignette I remember from that where a friend of mine who is Jewish showed up to a conversation because she needed a platform where she could say, I'm having a really hard time because all my Jewish friends, all my Jewish communities are very polarized, and I am against killing, period. And the only thing I'm prepared to say about this is around not killing innocent Jews, not killing innocent Palestinians. And that's just really hard for me to say in my community because I'm being disloyal. 2 nights ago, I was with a dear Muslim friend of mine, and her husband is Palestinian, so they have 2 teenage kids, and it must be really difficult for those kids in this country right now. And of course they have friends in Gaza, they have family in Gaza, they have friends over here who have friends and family in Gaza. So she is coming under a lot of pressure to pick sides, and she cannot do so. And they're saying, you're being disloyal. Like, no, I'm not. Because the killing is just wrong. It doesn't matter who's perpetrating it. So what she does, which she gave me an idea, which is it's really obvious, but I hadn't thought about it. She said, so I've been calling my politicians. Like, of course. She said, the politicians are hearing from all sorts of people who tell them to pick sides, which is why the politicians are picking sides. If they have a lot of people call them and say, please don't pick a side, tell people to stop killing each other, their voices will change, because that's what democratically elected politicians listen to. So, but you don't think of actions like that if you allow yourself to get caught up in the polarizing conversation. So again, it's settle down, first of all, this posture of generosity. So important as a foundation. And that creates the space for you to then move into this deeper posture, if you will, of virtue. Because that really is the most important thing we do with our lives, is how we choose to live them. And how we choose to live them is all about our framework of values. And we've got to remember that and stay true to that above all else. And if we can do that, then we've created stability for ourselves, and then we can settle down into the more contemplative side of things. Then we can sit on the cushion and settle down. We can use metta practice. We can engage at a human level where we can help. And we have a lot to be thankful for. We've got this human birth, this human existence. I'm enormously thankful, I hope you are too. I'm enormously thankful to have all of you. My life would be incomparably thinner, weaker, less colourful, less rich if you weren't in it. And I would be much less able to stay in my place of virtue without you here to support me in it. So we have a lot to be thankful for. The opportunity to help others, the opportunity to be generous. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I will stop talking